Welcome to MedTech Speed to Data, a KeyTech podcast. I'm your host, Andy Rogers, VP of Business Development at KeyTech. Each month, me and a KeyTecher are going to interview a MedTech leader and talk to them about the critical data-driven decisions they make in their programs. Hey everybody, welcome to MedTech Speed to Data. Happy New Year. I'm your host, Andy Rogers. Today, we have Jill Schiaparelli on the episode. Jill, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Andy, for having me.
Joe, we've known each other for many years. I'm very excited to have you on the episode for you to share your story. It's a great story. Why don't we start just by talking a little bit about your background that led to you founding the bioelectronic medicine company, Avation Medical.
Sure. I have been doing medical innovation for years, and what really excites me about it is the opportunity to change quality of life for patients. I spent many years at Johnson & Johnson and had the ability to learn the right way to bring innovation and disruptive technologies to market. And in 2007 or 8, I chose to go into the exciting world of startups. And since that time, I've brought 8 or 9 truly first-in-class technologies to market across a variety of indications and technology types. But again, the most rewarding thing is to think through all the steps that make a product successful and ultimately allow it to help patients and help physicians give care to patients.
Yeah, I love that that approach, I guess, to entrepreneurship, if you will. It reminds me of like you hear rumors of like the Japanese, like you have to start in manufacturing before you can do design. It's sort of like you where you worked in an innovation company for many years to understand the ropes, and then you're able to go out and do things on your own. It's I think a smart way to go about entrepreneurship.
And to be fair, there's not one way to do entrepreneurship, but what I think it does require, and I think the people that are successful at it are the people that understand the big picture, what they're really trying to accomplish. Just having a good technology, if you don't have anything else around it, you won't be successful. Or just having a big need, but with a not great technology, you won't be successful. You have to have all the puzzle pieces figured out.
Got it. All right. So let's talk about Avation
Sure.
in more detail. So what is the mission of Avation Medical? And I know you founded the company. You're kind of more of an advisor at this point. What is the mission of Avation, and what problem are you looking to solve?
So Avation, I was a co-founder, and Avation grew out of the notion or the recognition that neuromodulation or bioelectric medicine, you hear people use both words, is very nascent. And yet it delivers wonderful clinical outcomes across a wide variety of clinical applications. And what I observed is, especially in the bladder control space, which is where we started, is that there was a screaming need. But let me back up a second to talk about what bioelectric medicine is. I really believe it's another frontier right alongside, for example, pharmaceuticals and surgery. It's the ability to put electricity selectively into the nervous system to either enhance a function, control a function, or fix a function. And when you look at neuromodulation as a whole, there's so much we don't know about it. But historically, it's all been surgical implants. We think about the brain, we think about the spine. And the moment you say surgery, it complicates things. You need a physician who knows how to do it. And obviously the brain and spine are very complicated parts of the body. And you need a patient who's willing to have surgery, which could be a very extensive surgery. And you need a payer who's willing to pay for the surgery. So the question for me was, how do you solve for that? How do you make neuromodulation available to more people and really expand the promise of its clinical efficacy, but take surgery out of the equation? So back to Avation, the mission at its highest level was to deliver on the promise of neuromodulation by coming up with a wearable. And specifically, our first focus was in the bladder control space. And that was kind of why we started looking at that opportunity. Is that helpful?
That's great. Yeah, I mean, bioelectronic medicine, I agree, is a frontier in healthcare. A lot of value to add, and to eliminate the need for these interventional procedures like you described. So overactive bladder, right? So why that condition? And you may tell a little bit of the story of how you found either the technology or the need for overactive bladder. And
So I think from my J&J days, I've learned how to read a market and see the needs. And sometimes you can't just like walk into a doctor's office and say, what are your unmet needs? Sometimes you just have to listen. And one of the things that started out, I was working with an incubator, I was consulting, and we were looking at a surgical implant to treat overactive bladder, which is also called urge incontinence. And I started speaking to physicians, I started speaking to patients, I started speaking to payers. And why would you speak to all those people? Well, those are all the stakeholders that are going to make a product successful or fail. And if you don't get all of those legs of the stool correct, the stool's going to fall over. And one of the things that struck me, and this is where entrepreneurship is sometimes common sense, is something was wrong. There were 45 million people in the United States alone, I'm not even talking internationally, who have urge incontinence or overactive bladder. Every year, 9 million of them see a physician. We're talking diabetes huge here. This is a big, big market. And what struck me is a couple different things. Number one, very few patients stay in the care pathway, even though it's a chronic condition. And when you look at it from a patient perspective, the options kind of were stinky. They were forced to take medicines that had all kinds of unwanted side effects. Then they were offered other things, for example, a Botox injection into the bladder wall. It sounds great, but you have to go every 6 months, and sometimes it causes the inability to urinate. So now you have to self-catheterize. And then the more invasive neuromodulation options popped up. But the thing that really caught my attention is of those 9 million people a year, not only do 70% drop out of the care pathway, less than 0.1% had the most effective type of treatment, which was sacral nerve modulation, a $35,000 to $40,000 procedure that required a specially trained physician, and it required that the patient go through a lot of roadblocks that the payers set up because it is an expensive procedure. And when you look at those dynamics, it screams a need to you that patients want something that takes surgery out of the equation, that doesn't have the side effects of drugs, and that it's convenient. Remember, overactive bladder and incontinence are not like cancer and heart disease. They generally won't kill you, but they'll really reduce the quality of your life. So all of those things together sent a message that we could come up with a more common sense solution. And that was where the idea of a wearable started to come about.
Yeah, I was in prepping for this interview this morning. I was talking to my wife. She works in the ER, and she treats patients that come into her ED in this manner, and she's sympathizes with these patients. It's a chronic condition. There's only so many treatments out there. It is good to hear that there is one procedure that seems to work. It's just the price of it, right? So yeah, it seems like you really nailed the need and the product market sort of fit. So talk a little bit more about, if I'm pronouncing this correctly, the Vivali system.
Vivali, right.
Vivali, yeah, you're the product there at Avation.
Yeah. Sure. So as we started to venture down this path, and one thing every entrepreneur knows is you start out with ideas and visions, and then you have to tweak as you go along, you learn. And we learned very quickly that if you're putting a product and you're shifting the market into the home, you have to think about the patient experience. So one of the first things we said to ourselves is, how do we make this super convenient? We have, Vivali allows the patient to get therapy in just 30 minutes, as little as once a week. It's fully wearable. It's ankle worn. So what's novel here is we're stimulating the tibial nerve, which is on your inner ankle side. And if you want to think about what we're going for the nerves at the base of the spine that control the bladder or modulate the bladder. And the tibial nerve is almost like an on-ramp on the highway. We all know we're going to Cleveland, but depending on where we are, we're going to get on the highway at a different road or a different on-ramp. So that's really what we're doing with the tibial nerve. That electrical signal is able to travel up to the base of the spine, the sacral part where the nerves that innervate the bladder are. And what we're trying to do is basically calm the bladder by making that signal less erratic and more calm, if you will. And when we thought through the patient experience, it had to be super simple. So the ankle device has 2 pieces of Velcro. Patient's able to put it on in, under 15 seconds once they know how to put it on. We also have it controlled by an app on the patient's phone. So it's push button simple. You open up the app, you push go, and it just runs. And in the meantime, we also thought about what could the patient be doing during this time. We designed it so that the patient can move around. There's no limitations. We're not suggesting that they go out and run a marathon, but most people can have a half an hour a day where they're in the home, they're making dinner, they're folding laundry, which, by the way, was the number one thing people did in our clinical studies. That surprised us. And make it be really convenient. But the real innovation is that this is physiologic closed loop. That's the next frontier in neuromodulation. And what I mean by that is the system is reacting to the patient or the patient's biomarker. In this case, we're reading the EMG signal. And so what does that mean practically for the patient? It means that the therapy is personalized just for them. That's done in the physician's office at the time of prescription. Takes just a couple of minutes. It's not a big deal. And then the patient gets personalized therapy. The other thing it means is at any point during the 30-minute therapy, if the patient's electrical needs change, the system responds without the patient or the physician needing to do anything. It's all automated. And that's what allows the patient to have personalized, effective therapy in just 30 minutes once a week. Physiologic closed loop will be the way all neuromodulation goes in the future. Because if you think about it, just randomly putting electricity in the body, anybody can do that. But A, getting confirmation that it's reaching the target nerve, and B, that it's doing it in an amount that an individual patient needs is really neuromodulation nirvana, if you will.
Yeah, no, that's super cool. Anytime you say closed loop, investors perk up, right? So it makes sense.
Right. And the reason I'm emphasizing physiologic closed loop, there's a lot of different ways to define closed loop. The thermostat in your home is closed loop, right? It senses the temperature and the heat goes on or the air conditioning goes on. Physiologic closed loop is much more precise because it's responding to the patient's body. And that will become very important as we shift any therapy, not just neuromodulation, into the home. Because now you don't have a trained medical professional supervising therapy. So the system has to have the intelligence to be able to do that and do it safely.
Just real quick on that, on the closed loop piece, you mentioned, sounds like some sort of calibration step where you measure EMG in the clinic, kind of dial in the intensity of the therapy, I guess, and then you send them home with the device. Is that it, or is it reading EMG also in the home?
It's doing both. It's during the calibration and it's doing it during therapy. It's checking roughly 20 times a second. So it's virtually continuous monitoring during therapy and automatic adjustment. And people ask me, well, why would it need to change? And I think this is an area of neuromodulation that we're just beginning to understand. But the role of nerves are obviously to help you sense and also to help move your muscles. And every time you move a muscle, the amount of electricity that's needed in that nerve can change. So if the patient, for example, is walking around or crossing their legs or waving their hands like I'm doing now, the electrical demand changes. And having something that's constantly monitoring allows the therapy to adjust to that in real time.
Got it. Got it. All right, very cool. So that's the longest introduction I think in our podcast history. We haven't even gotten to the meat of it, but this is great. I mean, like I said, I'm a big fan of bioelectronic therapy. We've done some projects with GE, and we're talking to a lot of other companies in the like neuromodulation space. So let's get into the meat of this podcast: speed to data. And I always love this first question, Jill, like what was it that, sparked, enough for you to say, I'm going to do this? I know you mentioned you did a lot of what data was critical for you early on to convince you to say, let's do this. So you mentioned the market research, you nailed that. This technology, like where did you even think of a tibial nerve? Just like what were the kind of data points that came together for you that said early on, this is a venture that I'm willing to take?
I can answer that a lot of different ways, but the simplest was every area that we checked into, it made sense to do this. And I mentioned earlier that the three key stakeholders you start by looking at are the patient, the physician, and the payer.
Right.
And this technology in this market, or this technology in this market, checked all of those boxes to say that there's a need. We obviously talked about the patient need. We literally were having almost 9 million patients a year say, I would rather wear an adult diaper than get the therapies that are being offered by the medical profession.
That's not good. Yeah.
And right. And just walk down the aisle in Target or Walgreens or pick whatever your store is. There's an entire aisle dedicated to adult incontinence. Mm-hmm. And that aisle has grown over the years. We've watched it grow. So there's all these obvious signs in the market. The other thing that I started to understand is when I looked at who was treating overactive bladder, there were over 100,000 practitioners treating overactive bladder, but only 3,500 were trained in neuromodulation. And when you saw that imbalance, there was no way that 3,500 people were going to be able to treat the 9 million patients seeking care. So right away, there was a roadblock. So that was the physician perspective. The other thing that we understood about the physician is most of them were prescribing medications. In fact, some only prescribe medication. They weren't making a lot of money off of that. And I don't mean to say that physicians are money motivated, but when you write a prescription, all you're getting paid for is the office visit. Mm-hmm. And we had a lot of venture capitalists say to us, well, they're never going to prescribe a wearable because they make so much money doing an implant. And they do. They make good money doing an implant. But if that was true, if the thesis of the investor was true, you'd see much more than 0.1% adoption in sacral nerve implants. Mm-hmm. So we knew it wasn't money motivated. And these physicians truly wanted to help patients. That was the second leg of the stool. And the third leg of the stool, which some people might argue was the most powerful, were the economics. Think about it. If you're a payer, on the one hand, you're looking at spending $35,000 to $40,000-ish for sacral nerve. But the drugs are not a great story either, because this is a chronic condition. You're talking about paying for someone to be on drugs for the rest of their life, month after month after month. And a lot of these drugs are prescribed and the patient doesn't finish the prescription, so there's waste. So your question was, what were you looking for? And when you're somebody like me who reads markets and opportunity, we were able to speak to sort of the three big ones that investors would need to see. And we thought this was a real opportunity to disrupt the market.
Yeah, that's great. So I guess let's focus on then the product, right? So early on, how did you, not to get into too much detail on the product, right? But like, what data were you looking for early on to go from maybe NIH or, friends and family, angel, to maybe the Series A? Like what data from a product perspective were you focused on, and how did you go about collecting that data?
Yeah, there's there's a general flow that is followed regardless of the funding sources, but the first is market need and market demand, and then you kind of start to get a vision for what the product can look like and what the requirements are. And in this case, we understood the market. We even knew the pricing, and we suspected what the regulatory and clinical pathways were before we even knew what the product looked like. So way back when, we did a workshop with some of our engineers, and we laid out what the product had to have without
Mm-hmm.
saying what the product was, what it had to be and what it couldn't be. And we sent several people away, and we only gave them a couple days, and we said, come back with your early ideas. And we started to see the early iterations of what the product ultimately looked like. And obviously over years, it had to be refined. We had to do things like testing how easy is the garment to get on and off? How do you deal with different ankle and foot sizes and things like that? I think that was really the early phases of it. But then the question was, did it work? And when we were doing this in 2018 and 19, there was a firm belief that you could not stimulate peripheral nerves through a wearable.
Yeah.
And that really became the big obstacle. And that was where proof of concept came in. So in terms of those funding phases, the first was, do we have a market? The second was proof of concept. And for that, we did first of all, we did feasibility studies just on able-bodied patients to see if we could confirm that we could activate the nerve through the skin. And the challenge with neuromodulation when you're putting electricity through the skin is what's in your skin. Nerves that have sensory, and that's to protect us from putting our fingers or our toes on, something sharp or too hot to get a burn. And so how do you get that electricity in without causing pain? And then the second hurdle is, how do you know that the electricity is reaching the target? Again, anybody can come along and plop a TENS unit on your cheek and
Right.
say, I'm doing neuromodulation. You're not. And so that was where the idea of physiologic closed loop came from. How could we confirm that the nerve had been activated? And the tibial nerve is what's called a mixed nerve. So we're going to, anybody who's listening, who's into nerve, you have
This is the
sensory
good
nerves,
stuff. Yeah.
motor nerves, and you have mixed nerves. Well, tibial's a mixed nerve. So we were able to confirm that we were activating the sensory afferents in the nerve by reading the motor response. And that's what EMG is. We were reading that at the foot bottom. It's a
That's
little bit about
fantastic.
understanding the anatomy of the tibial nerve.
Yeah. It's like almost like instant confirmation that
It is.
you're
Well, that's
doing
exactly
something.
what it is.
Yeah.
Instant
Yeah.
confirmation.
Yeah. Yeah. But in an indirect way to your ultimate clinical application. So I mean, I'm going to paraphrase here, but did you basically understand the anatomy and physiology of the tibial nerve to the bladder, and that secondary sort of EMG in the foot is enough for you to say, yes, we're activating it. This is enough to say
Yes.
you're going to do something to the bladder. But then,
Yes.
so then let me ask another question. Like, this might get too far down into the science, but what are you doing to the bladder through the nerve? Is it the nerves are overreacting and this calms the bladder, or the other way around? Or
It's a good question, and I'll give you a very simple answer.
Yeah.
And it's this: nobody really fully understands what causes overactive bladder. So I'm going to have one of those pharmaceutical statements. It is believed that overactive bladder is inappropriate spasming of the bladder wall. So in other words, when you urinate, you get most, if you have a healthy bladder, you get a signal in your brain that says, oh, I think I have to go soon. You might be aware that you have to go, but as adults, we're usually able to control it for an hour or two, until you can get to the rest area. In somebody with overactive bladder, they may start to get that urge when the bladder is not anywhere near full. Typically, you start to get that urge when the bladder is 2/3 to 3/4 full. Somebody with overactive bladder might get that urge when there's only a small amount of fluid retained in the bladder. So that spasming is happening and you're getting a signal that you have to go. And people with very severe overactive bladder can get that urge 20 to 30 or more times a day, whereas somebody with a healthy bladder might only void 6 to 10 times a day. Obviously, if you're tailgating or doing something where you're drinking a lot, that's going to change. But in a typical day, 6 to 8 times. And we can usually all work running to the restroom 6 to 8 times a day into our schedule. But think about if you're working full time, you're a teacher, you have a bunch of you have 37-year-olds in your room, and you have to run to the bathroom every 30 to 45 minutes. How can you do that?
You can't.
The urge is disruptive to your life. So your question was, what is overactive bladder? It's this inappropriate spasming. And the concept for sacral nerve, which has been on the market for more than 25 years, was to target the S2 and S4 areas of the spine, the nerves that come out from there, because they are the nerves that control the muscles of the bladder. So you use the word calming. The thesis is that electrical signal is calming those bladder nerves and making those inappropriate spasms less apparent or less often. There's also another theory in neuromodulation that the signals going up to the brain, your voiding is controlled by something called your pontine micturition center. And there are products that are marketed that say we're controlling the signals from the brain. I think that's a little bit harder to prove. You're getting into M waves and F waves and all kinds of stuff that I don't fully understand, but it's very difficult to know for sure that the signal is getting up there. There are some studies where people are doing neuromodulation and measuring activity in the brain. And so perhaps in the future, we'll be able to confirm that electrical signal is affecting the pontine micturition center, but I'm not sure that the science is there yet.
Okay.
And I'm probably not the person to talk to about that. We were looking for very practical results. If we do this, does it have a positive clinical result? And will the patient continue to do it compliantly, et cetera? And the answer there is yes.
Yeah. Okay. Let's keep moving. And maybe we'll talk about, the current status of Avation and, FDA cleared now. Series A, and I mentioned at the top, you're kind of not as much involved with Avation Medical anymore, but for our audience are intrapreneurs, folks that are working at like a J&J, a BD, trying to drive new technology to market. Obviously, entrepreneurs who are trying to raise their Series A and trying to get cleared. And can you just talk a little bit about post clearance? I don't know how you would describe the company, but the enterprise where now you're looking to effectively scale. And what data are you looking for? And then maybe we can answer that in the context of the three legs of the stool.
Yeah. You asked a question earlier about what are investors looking for, and we focused on A. And the way that most, and we were venture backed. So the way most ventures work, venture capitalists work, is they want to fund you to the next reasonable milestone. But they also want to know what your long-term strategy is, because while somebody might come in an A or B round, they want to understand how much dilution they may experience in future rounds. So what they really want to try to understand when they're making an investment is, how much do I need to invest now to have a successful exit? I mean, like it or not, this is part of the ecosystem. We need companies to grow, need funding, and they come from different sources. We chose to go the venture capital route. So in our A round, we did have some money from an incubator. So our first round was the B round. And that was the round that allowed us to get through our clinical trials. And we did 2. We did a single arm and then we did a sham arm, and get to FDA clearance. The more recent round that we closed in January, about 23 million, was around early commercialization. And the milestones we laid out for there were, we wanted to be able to prove our selling model, and we wanted time to get some of the reimbursement in place. And when I talk about understanding the business model, you have a lot of options with an innovative product as to how you sell it. And so we wanted to really understand, did we get the patient target right? Did we get the physician target right? Did we get the pricing right? What is the payer reaction? And so where Avation Medical is in that spot right now. We're in what you would call a beta or a soft launch. I used to call it our ABC launch. This is A. And the whole idea here was to start slow, crawl. And so that as you moved into 25 and late 25, 26, you could scale dramatically. Again, remember, we're going after a 9 million patient a year market.
Yeah.
And what you really want to do is play for that. And I have now launched, I don't know, a lot of products, 10, 12 products. And anybody who tries to go to scale immediately never gets it right. I don't care who you are. I don't care how many products you've launched. You can do all the market research in the world, but your best proof is when you're in the market and being flexible and watching everything and being willing to adapt to what you're hearing. You
Yeah.
have to start with a really good thesis, but then you have to be prepared to say, how can I make this faster? How can I make this better? How can I help more people? And that's the point that Avation's at now.
Yeah, that's insightful and makes sense. I think you described it well. Key Tech is at a similar point. We're 75 people, and the word scale and automation is being thrown around a little bit more than it was 10, 15 years ago when we were a much smaller company. And the phrase that I always come back to is figure out what works, then automate it, and then scale it. So it sounds like that's what you've described that's happening at Innovation, is trying to find those right sales channels, I guess, tactics, and figure out what works, learn from them, and then try and lean into them. Is that right?
I think that's right. And at the very beginning, you asked what the mission was. And I think the mission for any company, Avation included, in the medical space is to help patients. And so I'm a big believer of start with the end in mind. We always have a 3-year strategy, so we know where we're going. And then we have annual objectives and tactics. And it doesn't mean that you do that 3-year strategy once, you update it annually. But the point is, if we were taking a trip somewhere, we'd need to decide what our destination is before we would know what to put in the suitcase. And are we going to drive? Are we going to fly? Successfully running a company is actually kind of similar to that. You have to understand where you're going to know the right way to get there. Otherwise, I can guarantee you won't get it right. And then you mentioned earlier, entrepreneurs, know everything you can about all the people in your market and what their needs are. And over the years, I've met so many well-meaning, super smart people who build a wonderful product and they're like, it's so great, it's just going to sell. I very rarely does that happen. Yeah, you have to understand all of the nuances and everybody in the ecosystem to understand how they're going to react. And that includes your competitors. A lot of people start working on a product 5 years in the past and they understand what the market looks like 5 years in the past. That's a mistake. You have to be able to have an understanding of what the market's going to look like when you launch into it, and maybe 3 or 5 years down the road from that, because that's what your real competition is.
Yeah, I was reading a book. It might have been the Rockefeller Habits or How to Be an Effective Executive, or one of these like management books. And the number one skill of a manager leader is to predict the future. So if you can predict the future, Jill, you let me know. If you have any tricks, you let me know. But as you were talking, it reminded me of one of our guests. I'm not going to mention the name. And they were talking about how challenging it is as a founder CEO of a startup medical device company to I struggle with this now, like set a vision and kind of stick to it, because that's what investors want to see. But then also, as you said, be aware of the market and be somewhat able to pivot as needed, and trying to strike that balance of like, be nimble, be aware as you're moving along. Of course, if you need to change course, do that. But also then that conflicts with like, leading a team and making decisions and driving forward even when there's noise, you know what I mean? So I guess, how do you manage that dynamic?
Yeah. So many things are running through my head right now. When we founded the company and we brought people on board, worked very hard to establish a strong culture that put the patient first. And I do have to give a nod to J&J. I'm sure you and most of your listeners have heard of the J&J credo. When I worked there, I fully believed in it. And it was all about the importance of putting the patients, the families, and the physicians who care for them first.
Mhm.
And it was very important to me that we had a similar culture at Avation. And we not only had what we called an edict, but we made sure that we reviewed the terms of that edict, and that the edict was an acronym that stood for different things. But it was guiding principles, and you have to always keep that in mind. And I'll give you an example. Whenever we hired anybody at the company, and this gets hard as you start to hire a lot of people, we had them interview not only with the people that they would be reporting to, who needed to assess their technical skills and their capabilities. We had them interview with people in other departments at all levels.
Mm,
Our office manager interviewed almost everybody who came in because
interesting.
we were looking for the cultural fit. Um, we cleverly called it the no asshole policy, and I hope it's okay if I said a bad word. But
Yeah.
but the point is, you are the company you keep, and I mean that in terms of people. We wanted people who were dedicated to the mission of helping patients and doing the right thing. And I also tried to instill a sense of giving grace to one another, recognizing not one of us ever gets everything right. I wanted Ovation to be a place where people wanted to work, because happy employees, you know, will deliver a good product, and they'll be empowered to do the right thing when those tough decisions come up.
Yeah. I think that's how I've handled it. A
Yeah.
mission, values, and then haven't gotten to it yet, but a series of principles, a dozen or so that help guide decision making. But I do like your 3-year view, kind of a rolling 3-year vision, which is not rocket science, but it really
It's
helps
not.
also in a similar manner set that sort of compass direction as you're making weekly or monthly sort of decisions too.
And then the other thing is it ensures alignment, right? We've all, I've been in other large organizations, and the thing that most of the time when there's a conflict or something fails, you look and you realize there's a lack of alignment. So the concept between the 3-year behind the 3-year strategy is, if we talk about what the goals are by functional area, and then you let each functional head determine their annual deliverables, and then that in turn rolls down to the employees' annual objectives. Well, nothing ever guarantees alignment, but it certainly keeps you pointed in the right direction.
Right. Yeah, very, very important. All right, so let's keep moving, Jill. So we're going to talk now. We're gonna skip to the lightning round, and
Oh,
it's
good.
going to be a lightning round.
Okay.
So, um, we've been talking about bioelectronic medicine, and can you just talk a little bit about maybe the future of that sliver of the healthcare space, and maybe exclude neuromodulation? Like, what are the next Avation type indications? Are investors enthused by this application? It seems like they should be. What are your opinions there of the growth of this
Yeah.
segment?
I think bioelectric medicine is the future, and you use the word sliver. I think it's a slice. I think it will
Okay.
it will stand alongside pharma and surgery, like its own arm. I keep a database. I track everything I can about current and future, even if they're ideas. I am tracking over 400 new technologies in bioelectric medicine.
Wow.
And so when you asked if investors are enthusiastic, I think some investors are. I think, certainly in this last round, I pitched to well over 100 investors, and all of them had been pre-screened for an interest in bioelectric or neuromodulation. But I will say there's a spectrum. I believe there are still investors out there that believe the only way to do bioelectric medicine is with a surgical implant. period. I don't
Yeah.
agree with them, but I do think, we got a lot of no's because people aren't yet willing to accept wearable as a way of doing this. But in terms of the trends I'm seeing, we're seeing a trend towards wearable. We're seeing a trend towards closed loop and physiologic closed loop. And I think there's a distinction between them. We're also seeing in the surgical space, new nerves being targeted, new indications. And the other thing we're seeing is smaller sizes. If any of your listeners have seen a sacral nerve implant, I'm trying to think. It's bigger than a matchbox. Maybe that's a dated reference. It's maybe 1 inch by 2.5 inches,
Hmm.
and maybe a quarter to a half an inch thick. Now we're seeing these very small pellet-like implants. We're also seeing variations on with battery and without battery. Obviously, with a battery tends to make them larger. But without a battery, then you have to solve for the recharging.
Right.
So there's pros and cons, and you really have to make the decisions individually for the market and the indication. The other thing we're seeing is expansion of indications in the pelvic floor space alone, which is where Avation was. We're seeing testing going on in fecal incontinence, in benign prostatic hyperplasia, and sexual function. And then beyond that, we're seeing applications in blood flow, pain, peripheral neuropathy. This will be a very different conversation 3 to 5 years from now if you're
Yeah.
interviewing somebody about
Yeah.
bioelectric medicine. It's going to boom.
Yeah, no, I'm like I said, we're really excited about this segment.
Yeah,
I'm glad you are too. So, I guess just
absolutely.
for our listeners, where do you get your market insights? Is it the bioelectronic report? That was one we were following there for a while. What else do you mine for this sort of info?
I haven't found one source that has everything, and it really depends what question you're trying to answer.
Hmm.
I like to look as broadly, and I've done this for 20 years. I like to look as broadly as I can. So I scour clinicaltrials.gov.
Hmm.
I have all kinds of Google alerts set up for anything, any of these words that we've used just to see what's going on. I listen at conferences. I love looking at the posters at conferences.
Yeah.
That's where there's all kinds of little gems. Obviously FDA filings and clearances, and it's a compilation of all those, which is why I keep a database on this,
Oh, your
because I
own
haven't found
proprietary.
one good, and then of course other sources like you talked about. But I think the thing you have to be very careful about in this market is the perspective of the person tracking the data,
Sure.
and making sure that if you want to go broad, they're looking broad, but if you want to go narrow, then you're fine if it's in a very specific spot. I think that's the point about innovation. Innovation, if something's being reported to everybody, it's probably not yet it's probably past the point of innovation. I
Yeah.
think innovation comes when we see things by putting together abstract notions that somebody else hasn't seen before
Yeah, I use the term nonlinear. I think that's kind of how the world works, but you have to do linear sort of things to lead to
to
those
get there.
nonlinear connections. Yep.
Yeah.
All right. So one other question for you, Jill. So maybe in the context of your 8 ventures you've worked on post J&J, talk a little bit about building a team. So you need to have like a founder. Mentioned you were a co-founder. I imagine you were more of like the market and executive, and then there was maybe a technology leader. That seems like a kind of a tried and true partnership. But talk a little bit about your team, and again, in your experience in your prior ventures. What are the key hires to make maybe 1, 2, 3 as you kind of go from the founder, co-founder sort of start?
To a certain extent, it depends on the company and the market and what you as the founder, what your own skill sets are. I am the least technical person you will ever meet, which is good and bad. It allows me to not know what my limitations are, because I just think everything's technically possible. But I knew I needed to be paired with a really good engineer. And so at Avation, one of the very first hires was our chief technology officer,
Okay.
Manish. And what I was looking for in that hire was an engineer who really knew his or her stuff, but who was also open-minded. Because when you go on a true innovation journey, what you don't want is the person who's going to tell you all the reasons something isn't going to work. You want somebody who you can sit with and have that conversation, go, what about this? And, have it be balanced. But in the case of Avation, that was one of the first hires. I think the other thing is we needed a person that who could handle sort of the running of the business while I was off trying to raise money and put the marketing and technical story together.
Mhm.
So we had a finance person who was very helpful with that. I think those were some early hires, but as you go, then you have to make decision about what you hire in full time and where you seek consultants or where you choose to outsource. And I think that's very business dependent.
Right. Maybe one follow-on question then for that. Let's talk a little bit about like quality system. Like, at what point did you decide to maybe set up your own quality system? I know this is sort of a random question, but like,
Yeah.
when did you go from like pure entrepreneurial sandbox to, okay, now we're medical OEM here. So at what point in your journey?
Yeah, it was pretty early on, and I think it was earlier than a lot of other companies do it, but I understand how difficult it is to put good manufacturing process and quality in after the fact. So it was in time after we had done our feasibility and around the time we were starting to do our first clinical trial. Because we knew that was going to be very important because we planned to use that clinical trial with our FDA submission.
Awesome. Yeah. Spoken from experience, Jill. So that always helps too. No replacing the experience there. Um, all right. And I think that's enough. I think we've covered a lot, Jill. I'm so thrilled you're able to come on the show. Speed to data. You're all over it. I think maybe last question I'll have for you is just talking about this messaging, speed to data. Um, does that resonate with you as a med tech leader? One change Key Tech plans to make. We're actually going to add on, right, speed to data. That's so important early on, but then speed to market, right? You can't just get data and be done, right? You have to get to market. So we're kind of trying to add two kind of phrases to our messaging. But just can you speak a little bit to the speed to data mindset?
Sure. It's super important that you understand the needs of your stakeholders. And I've spoken several times about investors. We needed to understand what we would have to demonstrate in every subsequent round. And so the data was not only clinical data, it was regulatory data.
Yeah.
It was payer data. In other words, we were talking to payers before we even knew what the product was, and patient data. So having that data, having a grasp on it, and being able to explain to someone how we interpreted that data was super important. And remember, we said earlier, start with the end in mind. We were very careful, for example, in the structure of our clinical trials to make sure we understood not only what the FDA wanted to see, but also what payers wanted to see. And I think a good entrepreneur really needs to understand what all these stakeholders, I feel like I'm beating this over the head, but it is so important, what they need to see down the road. So for example, right now, a big thing with the FDA is understanding diversity in the patient population. So we were very careful to make sure we had multiple genders and ages and even race and nationality represented in our patient populations. We were also very clear about what the previous treatments had been in the study because we knew from a payer perspective we wanted to be first or second line and not third line. So we were very conscious about making sure we had patients all along the care pathway. And so you really have to be deliberate about this. It's speed, absolutely, but it's also intelligent data that speaks to the needs of all the people that you'll need to demonstrate down the line.
Love that.
Clinical studies are really, really expensive. You can't go back and just add a multi-million-dollar study on because you forgot to get one piece of data out of it.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's huge. I think we typically have this lens of, technology development and the de-risking of, product development, but clearly at the, enterprise level, there's smart data, not just the speed. You can't be fast and incomplete. I get that. Yeah.
But then again, the speed is important too, because money only gets you so far. Every month
Right.
that you exist and you're not generating revenue, you're spending money. And eventually that pot of money can go away. And so you have to kind of back to used a word earlier, balance. There's a lot of balancing acts going on.
Well, Jill, thanks again for coming
Yeah.
on. Love the
Well, thanks
story.
for doing this.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a great service Keytech is providing to
Yeah.
entrepreneurs.
Yeah. I haven't said this before, but I would love to have you back on in a year or two, depending on, what you're up to and what new enterprises you might be advising or starting, or at least reconnect on bioelectronic medicine. So
I would
until then,
love that, Andy. Yeah. Thanks again for all the work you and your team do. It's
all right.
terrific.
Thank you, Jill. Thanks,
Sure.
everyone. We're kicking off 2025 with a bang. Looking forward to a lot of great episodes this year. Stay tuned.
Thanks for tuning in to MedTech Speed to Data, a Keytech podcast. Join us each month for more ways to get the right data faster to inform critical decisions. Find additional resources on our website, keytechinc.com. If you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe, and please leave a review on iTunes whenever you listen. Thanks.